Welcome tonight. We are going to talk about the Cheyenne people. In the vast expanse of the North American Great Plains, where the horizon stretches endlessly in all directions and the wind carries stories across grasslands that once sustained millions of buffalo, there lived a people whose name would become synonymous with the spirit of the plains themselves. The Cheyenne, known to themselves as Tsitsistas, meaning the people or our people, built a civilization that flourished across the heartland of what would become the United States, adapting to dramatic environmental changes, forging powerful alliances, and facing challenges that would test the very foundations of their society. Tonight, we embark on a journey through centuries of Cheyenne history, from their origins in the eastern woodlands to their transformation into one of the most formidable equestrian cultures the world has ever known. We will walk through their camps, witness their ceremonies, ride alongside their warriors, and come to understand how a people maintained their identity and dignity through times of both triumph and tragedy. This is not simply a story of conflict, though conflict certainly shaped their path. Rather, it is a story of adaptation, resilience, cultural richness, and the enduring strength of a people who refused to be forgotten. As we settle in for this exploration, let the rhythm of the narrative carry you across time and space to an era when the Great Plains teemed with life, when entire nations moved with the seasons, and when the Cheyenne people carved out their place in history through courage, wisdom, and an unbreakable connection to the land that sustained them. The story of the Cheyenne begins not on the Great Plains, but in the woodlands and lakes region of what is now Minnesota. Before they became the horse-mounted buffalo hunters of legend, the Cheyenne were a settled people, living in permanent or semi-permanent villages, cultivating crops and navigating the waterways of the upper Mississippi River Valley and the headwaters of the Minnesota River. Archaeological evidence and oral traditions suggest that the Cheyenne once lived much farther east, possibly along the Great Lakes or even beyond. Their language, part of the Algonquian family, connects them to a vast network of peoples stretching from the Atlantic coast to the Rocky Mountains, including the Arapaho, with whom they would later form one of the most enduring alliances in Native American history. In these early times, before European contact transformed the continent, the Cheyenne lived in a world of birch bark canoes, wild rice harvests, and woodland hunting. They constructed dome-shaped wigwams covered with bark or hides, tended gardens of corn, beans, and squash, and supplemented their diet with fish, waterfowl, and game from the forests. Their society was organized around extended family groups, with leadership emerging through demonstrated wisdom, generosity, and spiritual power rather than rigid hereditary succession. The spiritual life of the early Cheyenne centered on maintaining balance with the natural world and the spirit beings that inhabited it. They understood the universe as filled with power, Mayun, that could be accessed through proper ritual, prayer, and sacrifice. Dreams and visions served as conduits to the spirit world, providing guidance, warnings, and power to those who sought them with humility and respect. But the world was changing. By the late 1600s and early 1700s, ripples from European colonization of the eastern seaboard were reaching deep into the continent's interior. Native peoples who had obtained firearms from European traders began pushing westward, displacing other groups in a cascading effect that would reshape the demographic map of North America. The Ojibwa and Cree, armed with guns from French and British traders, began expanding their territory, putting pressure on peoples living to their west and south. For the Cheyenne, this pressure came at a critical time. Oral traditions speak of conflicts with neighboring peoples, resource scarcity, and a growing sense that their future lay elsewhere. Around the early to mid-1700s, the Cheyenne made a momentous decision. They would leave their homeland and journey westward toward the open plains that stretched beyond the horizon. This migration was not a single, sudden movement, but a gradual process that unfolded over decades. Different bands moved at different times, following river valleys westward, establishing temporary settlements, and then moving on again. Some Cheyenne groups remained in the Minnesota region into the late 1700s, while others had already established themselves along the Missouri River, or even farther west. The migration brought the Cheyenne into contact with new peoples, new landscapes, and new ways of life. As they moved westward, they encountered Earth Lodge-dwelling peoples like the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara, who lived in substantial villages along the Missouri River, growing corn and trading extensively with groups from across the plains. These encounters would prove transformative. From these sedentary agricultural peoples, the Cheyenne learned new farming techniques adapted to the shorter growing season and drier conditions of the plains. They also began to participate in extensive trade networks that connected the Mississippi Valley to the Rocky Mountains, the pueblos of the Southwest to the boreal forests of Canada. Through these networks flowed not just goods but ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. And through these networks came something that would revolutionize Cheyenne life more profoundly than any other single factor: the horse. The horse, reintroduced to the Americas by Spanish conquistadors in the 1500s, spread northward from New Spain through trade and raiding, transforming indigenous societies across the Great Plains in what scholars have called one of the most rapid and complete cultural transformations in human history. For the Cheyenne, the acquisition of horses in the early to mid-1700s marked the beginning of their golden age. Before horses, the plains had been traversed on foot, with dogs serving as beasts of burden, pulling travois loaded with camp equipment and supplies. Hunting buffalo on foot required elaborate coordination, with hunters driving herds toward cliffs, buffalo jumps, or into corrals where they could be killed in large numbers. This method was effective but dangerous and required the cooperation of large groups of people. The horse changed everything. Suddenly, hunters could pursue buffalo across open grasslands, matching the speed and endurance of these massive animals. A good buffalo horse trained to run alongside the herd while the rider fired arrows into the vital organs of his chosen target became a man's most prized possession. Women, too, benefited from horses, as pack animals could now carry far more than dogs, making the transportation of household goods, hides, and meat far more efficient. With horses, the Cheyenne could hunt more effectively, move their camps more quickly, travel greater distances, and transport more possessions. The entire structure of their society began to shift. Village agriculture, while still practiced by some groups into the early 1800s, became less central to Cheyenne life. Instead, they embraced full nomadism, following the buffalo herds across the vast grasslands of the Central Plains. The teepee, a conical dwelling of buffalo hide stretched over a framework of poles, became the standard Cheyenne home. Ingeniously designed, the teepee was perfectly adapted to life on the plains. It could be erected or dismantled in less than an hour, provided excellent insulation against both summer heat and winter cold when properly ventilated and banked with earth, and could withstand the fierce winds that swept across the open grasslands. The interior, arranged around a central fire, provided a comfortable living space for an extended family, with specific areas designated for sleeping, cooking, and storage. Cheyenne camps, when gathered together, could be impressive sights. Hundreds of teepees arranged in a great circle with each band occupying its traditional position, the opening of the circle always facing east to greet the rising sun. Smoke rising from countless fires, horses grazing on the surrounding grasslands, children playing, women tanning hides or processing meat, men caring for horses or crafting weapons. These camps were bustling communities that moved across the landscape in rhythm with the seasons and the movements of the buffalo. The buffalo provided nearly everything the Cheyenne needed. The meat, of course, was the primary food source, consumed fresh in spring, summer, and fall, and dried into jerky or pounded with fat and berries into pemmican for winter storage. But the buffalo gave so much more. The hide provided covering for tipis, material for clothing, bags and parfleshes for storing food and belongings. Sinew became thread and bowstrings. Horns were shaped into spoons and cups. Bones became tools and weapons. The bladder served as a water container. Hair was woven into rope. Even the dried dung buffalo chips provided fuel for fires on the treeless plains. This deep dependence on the buffalo shaped every aspect of Cheyenne culture. The buffalo was honored in ceremony and song, thanked for its sacrifice, and never wasted. Elaborate rituals governed the communal buffalo hunts, with hunt leaders, men chosen for their spiritual power and practical knowledge, coordinating the actions of dozens or even hundreds of hunters to ensure success and safety. Violations of hunt discipline could be severely punished, for one impulsive act could stampede the herd and deprive the entire community of food. As the Cheyenne became more fully adapted to plains life, their society took on the characteristic features of the equestrian buffalo hunters. Wealth came to be measured in horses. A successful man might own dozens of horses, using them as gifts to secure marriages, honor friendships, and demonstrate his success. Young men proved their courage and skill through horse raiding, venturing deep into enemy territory to steal prized animals from rival tribes. These raids were not simply acts of theft, but recognized tests of bravery, requiring stealth, planning, courage, and luck. The warrior tradition, which had existed among the Cheyenne in their woodland days, became even more central to their culture. Young men joined warrior societies, the fox, the elk, the dog soldiers, and others, each with its own regalia, songs, dances, and standards of conduct. These societies served multiple functions. They provided discipline during buffalo hunts, policed the camps, organized military expeditions, and gave young men a structured path to achieve status and recognition. But warfare on the plains was governed by its own logic, quite different from the European model of conflict the Cheyenne would later encounter. Plains warfare emphasized individual acts of bravery rather than killing enemies. Counting coup, touching an enemy with a special stick or with one's hand, was considered far braver than killing from a distance. Rescuing a wounded comrade, capturing an enemy's horse from within his camp, or being the first to strike an enemy all brought honor and status. This is not to say that plains warfare was bloodless. Men died in raids and battles, sometimes in significant numbers. But the cultural emphasis was on demonstrating bravery, earning honor, and achieving personal glory rather than on territorial conquest or the annihilation of enemies. Conflicts arose over hunting territories, horse theft, revenge for killed relatives, or simply the desire of young men to prove themselves. These conflicts could be intense and bitter, leading to cycles of revenge that could last for generations, but they rarely threatened the existence of entire peoples. During this period, the Cheyenne expanded their territory significantly. By the late 1700s, they ranged across a vast area of the Central Plains, from the Black Hills of present-day South Dakota and Wyoming south to the Arkansas River in what would become Kansas and Colorado. This territory overlapped and sometimes conflicted with the ranges of other powerful peoples: the Lakota Sioux to the north, the Pawnee to the east, the Kiowa and Comanche to the south, the Crow to the northwest, and others. Through this landscape, the Cheyenne moved in regular patterns, following the buffalo and seeking the best grazing for their horses. Winters were often spent in sheltered valleys along rivers where cottonwood bark could feed the horses, and wood was available for fires. Spring brought renewal and the great gathering of the tribes, when scattered bands came together for ceremonies, socializing, and communal buffalo hunts. Summer was a time of abundance, when the buffalo were fat and numerous. Fall meant preparing for winter, hunting intensively to build up stores of dried meat and gathering materials for the cold months ahead. To understand the Cheyenne fully, we must look beyond their external history and examine the intricate social structures and cultural practices that gave their society coherence and meaning. The Cheyenne were not simply nomadic hunters, but a people with a sophisticated worldview, complex social organization, and rich ceremonial life. At the foundation of Cheyenne society was the extended family band, typically consisting of several related families, often brothers and their wives and children, or a man and his married daughters and their husbands. These bands were the basic economic and social units. They camped together, hunted together, and traveled together, making collective decisions about when and where to move. These bands, in turn, were organized into larger divisions. The Cheyenne recognized 10 principal bands, each with its own leadership and territory within the broader Cheyenne range. These bands had distinct identities and sometimes different dialects or customs, yet they all recognized themselves as tsitsistas, as Cheyenne, bound together by language, ceremony, and kinship. Leadership among the Cheyenne was earned rather than inherited. The most respected leaders were peace chiefs, men who had proven themselves as warriors in their youth, but who in maturity demonstrated wisdom, generosity, eloquence, and spiritual power. These chiefs formed a council, traditionally consisting of 44 men, with representatives from each of the bands. This council of 44 made decisions affecting the entire tribe, resolved disputes, decided when and where the tribe would gather for ceremonies, and provided moral leadership. The peace chiefs were expected to embody Cheyenne ideals. They should be generous to the point of poverty, giving away their possessions to those in need. They should be even-tempered, never showing anger even under provocation. They should place the welfare of the people above their own interests. And they should avoid violence, using persuasion and consensus rather than coercion to lead. This emphasis on peaceful leadership might seem at odds with the warrior culture that was also central to Cheyenne life, but the Cheyenne understood that different situations required different kinds of leadership. While peace chiefs guided the tribe in times of calm and made decisions about camp movements and ceremonies, warrior society leaders organized military expeditions and buffalo hunts. The warrior societies, or military societies as they are sometimes called, were central to Cheyenne's social life for men. Each society had its own history, regalia, songs, and traditions. The dog soldiers, perhaps the most famous of these societies, became particularly prominent in the 1800s. They had a reputation for fierceness in battle and strict adherence to their vows. A dog soldier who declared he would not retreat from a battle position would stake himself to the ground with a special sash and fight there until victory, death, or release by a fellow society member. For women, while there were no formal societies equivalent to the men's warrior societies, there were nevertheless clear paths to status and recognition. Skilled craftswomen, particularly those who excelled at the intricate beadwork and quill work that decorated clothing and ceremonial objects, were highly respected. Women who demonstrated generosity, wisdom, and proper conduct could also achieve informal leadership roles, particularly in matters relating to women's activities and ceremonies. The Cheyenne recognized 4 principal virtues that defined proper conduct: bravery for men, industriousness for women, generosity for all, and spiritual wisdom for those who sought it. These virtues were not merely abstract ideals but practical guides for daily life, reinforced through stories, ceremonies, and the example of respected elders. Marriage among the Cheyenne was a carefully regulated affair. Young people had considerable freedom to court and choose their partners, but marriages required approval from the families involved and were formalized through exchanges of gifts. A young man might court a young woman for months or even years, standing outside her family's teepee, wrapped in a blanket, in the hope she would come out and share it with him so they could talk privately. If the relationship became serious, his family would approach hers with gifts, horses particularly, to formalize the union. Once married, a couple typically lived near the wife's family, at least initially, with the husband joining his wife's band. This matrilocal residence pattern meant that women maintained close connections with their mothers, sisters, and other female relatives throughout their lives, creating strong bonds between women in the band. Child-rearing was a communal affair. Children were raised not just by their parents but by the entire extended family and band. Grandparents often took primary responsibility for teaching children, passing on stories, skills, and values. Cheyenne children were rarely physically punished. Instead, they learned through observation, gentle instruction, and sometimes public shaming if their behavior fell too far short of expectations. From an early age, children were taught the skills they would need as adults. Boys learned to ride horses almost as soon as they could walk, practiced with small bows and arrows, and accompanied men on hunting trips to observe and learn. Girls learned the intricate work of hide tanning, beadwork, and quill work from their mothers and grandmothers, skills that would be essential to their family's welfare and their own status in the community. The naming of children was a sacred act. A child might receive several names over the course of their life, each marking a significant transition or achievement. Names might commemorate a vision, an event that occurred at the time of birth, or be given to honor a respected relative. For warriors, new names might be earned through acts of bravery or significant accomplishments. The spiritual life of the Cheyenne was rich and complex, woven into every aspect of daily existence. The Cheyenne universe was alive with spiritual power, from the great cosmic forces of thunder and lightning to the spirits that inhabited every animal, plant, and natural feature of the landscape. Maintaining proper relationships with these spiritual forces was essential not just for individual success, but for the survival and prosperity of the entire people. Central to Cheyenne spirituality was Maheo, the Great Spirit or All-Father who created the world and all living things. But Maheo was not a distant, abstract deity. The Cheyenne understood the sacred as immediate and present, accessible through vision quests, ceremonies, and proper conduct. The goal of spiritual practice was not salvation in an afterlife, but maintaining harmony and balance in this world, ensuring the renewal of life, the return of the buffalo, and the well-being of the people. The most sacred objects in Cheyenne possession were the sacred arrows and the sacred buffalo hat. These objects, which could never be viewed casually but only in ceremony, embodied the spiritual power and identity of the entire people. The sacred arrows, 4 in number, represented the male principle and were associated with success in warfare. The sacred buffalo hat, made from the hide and horns of a buffalo cow, represented the female principle and was associated with the renewal of life and abundance. These sacred objects had their own keepers, men who had been chosen or called to this responsibility, and who maintained the objects, conducted the ceremonies associated with them, and ensured their safety. The keeper of the sacred arrows, or sacred, buffalo hat held enormous spiritual responsibility. for any disrespect or improper handling of these objects could bring disaster to the entire tribe. The most important ceremony associated with the sacred arrows was the arrow renewal, held when the arrows needed to be renewed through ritual, usually after someone had been killed by a Cheyenne or when the tribe faced some crisis. This ceremony could last several days and involved the entire tribe. The arrows would be unwrapped, prayers and songs offered, and the arrows ceremonially renewed to restore their power and the balance of the universe. The sun dance, known to the Cheyenne as the New Life Lodge or Medicine Lodge ceremony, was the most important annual ceremony. Held in early summer when the bands gathered together, the sun dance was a complex ceremony lasting several days that involved fasting, prayer, dancing, and for some participants, self-sacrifice through piercing. The ceremony began with the selection and cutting of a sacred cottonwood tree, which would serve as the central pole of the Sun Dance Lodge. This tree was treated with great reverence, for it represented the connection between earth and sky, human and divine. The lodge itself, constructed around this central pole with radiating poles, forming a circular structure, represented the universe in miniature. Dancers who had pledged to participate in the sun dance underwent rigorous fasting and purification. Some would have wooden skewers inserted under the skin of their chest or back, with rawhide ropes connecting them to the central pole or to buffalo skulls that they would drag. As they danced, gazing at the sun, blowing eagle bone whistles, the weight and movement would eventually tear the skewers free, fulfilling their vow and bringing visions and spiritual power. This practice often shocked and horrified white observers, who saw it as barbaric self-torture. But for the Cheyenne, it was an act of profound sacrifice and devotion. Through their suffering, the dancers were praying for the renewal of life, for the welfare of the people, for success in hunting and warfare. They were demonstrating their willingness to sacrifice their own comfort and flesh for the greater good, following the example of culture heroes who had done the same in the mythic past. The sun dance was also a great social occasion. While the dancers and ceremony leaders conducted the sacred rituals, the rest of the tribe camped in a great circle around the lodge, visiting with relatives they might not have seen since the previous summer. Courting, racing horses, gambling, feasting, and celebrating their collective identity as tsitsistas. Vision quests were another central element of Cheyenne spirituality. Young men, and sometimes women, would go alone to isolated places to fast and pray, seeking a vision that would grant them spiritual power and guidance for their lives. These vision quests might last several days, during which the seeker would neither eat nor drink, subjecting themselves to the elements and focusing all their attention on their prayers. A successful vision quest might result in a vision of an animal, a natural force like thunder or lightning, or a spirit being who would become the seeker's supernatural helper. This spirit would grant powers, perhaps skill in warfare, healing abilities, or success in hunting, and would provide a sacred song and instructions for creating personal medicine objects that would serve as connections to that power. Not everyone received powerful visions, and there was no shame in this. Some people never went on vision quests at all, living ordinary lives as respected members of the community. But those who did receive power were expected to use it responsibly for the benefit of the people, not for selfish purposes. Misuse of spiritual power could cause it to turn against the user, bringing illness, misfortune, or death. Healing ceremonies were important spiritual practices. When someone became seriously ill, a medicine man or woman might be called to diagnose the spiritual cause of the illness and perform the appropriate ceremony to restore health. These healing ceremonies might involve the use of sacred plants, sacred songs, the manipulation of objects of power, or the enactment of sacred dramas that reenacted mythic events. The Cheyenne also had a rich mythology, a collection of sacred stories that explained the origins of the world, the creation of the Cheyenne people, and the proper way to live. These stories were not merely entertainment, but sacred teachings, passed down from generation to generation, explaining how things came to be and why the Cheyenne did things in certain ways. One central figure in Cheyenne mythology was Sweet Medicine, a culture hero who lived in the distant past and who brought many of the central elements of Cheyenne culture to the people. It was Sweet Medicine who journeyed to the sacred mountain and received the sacred arrows from the spirits. It was Sweet Medicine who established the Council of 44 and taught the Cheyenne their laws and proper conduct. And it was Sweet Medicine who, before his death, prophesied the coming of white people and the changes they would bring, warning the Cheyenne to remain strong in their traditions. Another important figure was Erect Horns, a woman who brought the sacred buffalo hat to the people and taught them the ceremonies associated with it. These culture heroes served as models of proper conduct and as connections to the sacred foundations of Cheyenne society. As the Cheyenne established themselves on the Central Plains in the late 1700s and early 1800s, they forged one of the most significant alliances in Native American history with the Arapaho people. The Arapaho, like the Cheyenne, were Algonquian speakers who had migrated westward onto the plains. Despite being distinct peoples with their own languages, territories, and traditions, the Cheyenne and Arapaho formed a bond of friendship and mutual support that would endure for generations. This alliance was formalized through ceremonies, intermarriage, and mutual defense pacts. The two peoples often camped together, coordinated their buffalo hunts, and fought alongside each other against common enemies. The alliance was so close that outsiders sometimes had difficulty distinguishing between the two groups, though the Cheyenne and Arapaho themselves maintained distinct identities and tribal structures. Together, the Cheyenne and Arapaho controlled a vast territory across the Central Plains. This territory included some of the richest buffalo hunting grounds on the continent, areas where the great herds migrated in numbers that staggers the imagination today. Early white travelers to the plains described herds so vast that they covered the prairie from horizon to horizon, taking days to pass a given point. But this territory was contested. The Cheyenne and Arapaho found themselves in complex relationships with neighboring peoples, sometimes peaceful, sometimes hostile, and often shifting between the two states depending on circumstances. To the north, the Lakota Sioux were becoming increasingly powerful. The Lakota, who had themselves migrated westward under pressure from other tribes and had acquired horses and guns, were expanding aggressively into the plains. Initial conflicts between the Cheyenne and Lakota gave way to an alliance, formalized around 1840, that would have profound consequences for all the peoples of the northern and central plains. The Cheyenne-Lakota alliance created a powerful bloc that dominated much of the plains from the Black Hills to the Platte River. This alliance was complicated, however, by the fact that the Cheyenne people were beginning to divide geographically and politically. The northern Cheyenne increasingly associated with the Lakota, ranging through the Powder River country of present-day Montana and Wyoming. The southern Cheyenne maintained closer ties with the Arapaho and ranged through present-day Colorado and Kansas, along the Arkansas and South Platte rivers. This division was not absolute. Northern and southern Cheyenne still considered themselves one people and gathered together for major ceremonies. But it would become more pronounced over time and would have significant consequences when conflict with the United States began. To the east, the Pawnee remained traditional enemies. The Pawnee, a settled agricultural people who also hunted buffalo, controlled territory in what is now Nebraska. Conflicts between the Cheyenne and Pawnee were frequent and often brutal, rooted in competition for hunting grounds and in long-standing animosities. Cheyenne oral traditions and 19th century accounts are filled with stories of raids and counter-raids, of battles won and lost, of captives taken and sometimes adopted or ransomed back. To the south, the Kiowa and Comanche were both rivals and, at times, allies. These powerful Southern Plains peoples controlled territory stretching from the Arkansas River deep into Texas and New Mexico. Conflicts with the Kiowa and Comanche were common in the early 1800s, but by the 1840s the Cheyenne and Arapaho had negotiated a peace, formalized in the Great Gathering at Bent's Fort in 1840. This peace allowed all the Plains peoples to focus their attention on new threats that were beginning to appear on the horizon. For by the 1840s, the world the Cheyenne knew was beginning to change in fundamental ways. White Americans who had been a distant presence on the edges of Cheyenne awareness were arriving on the plains in increasing numbers, bringing with them technologies, diseases, and ambitions that would transform the plains forever. The first sustained contact between the Cheyenne and Euro-Americans came through the fur trade. French traders had been present in the Mississippi Valley since the 1600s, and British and later American traders followed. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, trading posts were being established on the Missouri River, and even farther west, bringing manufactured goods into the plains, metal tools and weapons, glass beads, cloth, and firearms. The Cheyenne participated enthusiastically in this trade. Buffalo robes, the tanned hides of buffalo cows that were soft and warm, became valuable trade commodities. Women did the labor-intensive work of tanning these hides, scraping, working, and softening them until they were supple and beautiful. A skilled woman might produce several dozen robes in a season, which could be traded for goods that made life easier or more comfortable. Metal pots that didn't break like pottery, steel knives that held an edge far better than stone or bone, cloth that didn't require the laborious processing of hides. The trading posts also became important gathering places. Bent's Fort, established on the Arkansas River in present-day Colorado in 1833, became a major center of trade and diplomacy for the Southern Plains. The Bent brothers, who built and operated the fort, married into Cheyenne families and developed close relationships with the tribe. The fort served not just as a trading center, but as a place where different tribes could meet, where news could be exchanged, and where the Cheyenne could maintain relationships with the outside world on their own terms. But trade brought more than goods. It also brought disease. The Cheyenne, like all Native Americans, had no immunity to European diseases. Smallpox, cholera, measles, and other infectious diseases swept through plains populations in devastating epidemics. The smallpox epidemic of 1837-1838 killed thousands across the plains. Entire bands could be wiped out in weeks, leaving survivors to burn the dead and flee from death camps filled with corpses. These epidemics were catastrophic not just because of the death toll, but because of who died. Disease struck indiscriminately, killing not just the weak, but the strong, not just the young, but the experienced leaders, healers, and knowledge keepers. Each epidemic eroded the foundations of traditional culture, taking with it irreplaceable knowledge and experience. The 1840s brought new challenges. The opening of the Oregon Trail, which ran through Cheyenne territory along the Platte River, brought increasing numbers of white emigrants westward. These wagon trains, sometimes numbering hundreds of vehicles, carried thousands of people each year, all passing through the heart of the plains. The emigrants consumed wood and grass along the route, disturbed game, and sometimes behaved arrogantly or violently toward native peoples they encountered. Initially, the Cheyenne and other plains peoples tolerated this intrusion, Some even profited from it, trading with the emigrants, guiding them, helping them recover lost stock. But as the traffic increased year after year, it became clear that this was not a temporary phenomenon, but a fundamental alteration of the plains. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 intensified the migration. The trickle of emigrants became a flood, and with the emigrants came soldiers, sent to protect the trail and maintain order. The United States was extending its reach westward, and the Cheyenne found themselves increasingly in the path of American expansion. In 1851, the United States government organized a great council at Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming. Thousands of native people from across the plains gathered for this council, one of the largest gatherings of its kind ever held. The government's goal was to establish peace between the plains tribes and to secure safe passage for emigrants along the Oregon Trail. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 attempted to define territories for each plains tribe and to establish principles for managing relations between the tribes and the United States. In exchange for allowing emigrants to pass safely through their territory, the plains tribes would receive annual payments of goods. The Cheyenne and Arapaho were assigned territory between the North Platte and Arkansas rivers, encompassing much of present-day eastern Colorado and western Kansas. But the treaty was problematic from the start. The government negotiators misunderstood the political structure of the plains tribes, treating chiefs who had no authority to speak for the entire tribe as if they were sovereign rulers. Many Cheyenne, particularly those in the north who had not attended the council, did not consider themselves bound by the treaty. And the boundaries drawn on paper bore little relationship to the reality of how plains peoples actually used the land. Moreover, the United States had no intention of stopping white expansion at the boundaries it had just guaranteed to the tribes. The discovery of gold in Colorado in 1858 brought tens of thousands of prospectors flooding into Cheyenne territory. The government did nothing to stop this invasion, though it violated the terms of the 1851 treaty. Towns and mining camps sprang up in the mountains and along the Front Range. Denver was founded in 1858 on land that had been guaranteed to the Cheyenne just 7 years earlier. Some Cheyenne leaders, recognizing the futility of resistance and the power of the United States, counseled accommodation. Black Kettle, a peace chief of the Southern Cheyenne, advocated for finding a way to coexist with the Americans, even as it became clear that such coexistence would require tremendous sacrifices. Other leaders, particularly among the Dog Soldiers and the Northern Cheyenne, rejected accommodation and prepared to defend their territory and way of life. The 1850s saw increasing tensions and sporadic violence. Young Cheyenne men, frustrated by the invasion of their territory and the arrogance of the whites, raided settlements and attacked travelers. The U.S. Army responded with punitive expeditions that often struck at the wrong targets, killing peaceful Indians and leaving hostile ones untouched, thereby ensuring that violence would continue. In 1857, a Cheyenne man was killed by a white man in a dispute over a horse. The killer was not punished. In retaliation, Cheyenne warriors raided a wagon train, killing several people. The army responded by attacking a Cheyenne village, killing several people, including some who had not been involved in any hostilities. This pattern, a disputed incident, retaliation, counter-retaliation, escalation, would repeat itself over and over in the coming years. By the early 1860s, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Civil War had broken out in the eastern United States, drawing away regular army troops and leaving the frontier defended by poorly trained volunteers. Colorado, seeking statehood, was populated by ambitious men who saw the elimination of Indian tribes as a path to land and wealth. And the buffalo herds, stressed by overhunting and competition with the cattle and horses of the whites, were beginning to decline. The events of November 29th, 1864, would forever mark a turning point in Cheyenne history. On that cold morning, a peaceful village of Cheyenne and Arapaho, camped on Sand Creek in southeastern Colorado, was attacked by Colorado volunteers under the command of Colonel John Chivington. Black Kettle, the principal chief of the village, had been pursuing peace with the Americans. He had met with government officials and army officers, had been told to camp at Sand Creek, where he would be under military protection, and believed his people were safe. That morning, as the soldiers appeared on the horizon, Black Kettle raised an American flag over his lodge, along with a white flag of surrender, signals that this was a peaceful camp under the protection of the United States. The flags meant nothing to Chivington and his men. The attack was immediate and brutal. Soldiers fired into the village indiscriminately, killing men, women, and children. People who tried to surrender were shot down. Those who fled were pursued and killed. The soldiers then mutilated the bodies, taking scalps, body parts, and personal items as trophies, which they would later display in Denver saloons to the cheers of crowds. By the time the attack ended, between 150 and 200 Cheyenne and Arapaho lay dead, the majority of them women, children, and elderly men. The warriors had been away hunting. Black Kettle escaped, but his wife was shot multiple times, though she survived. The survivors fled north, carrying the news of the massacre to other Cheyenne and Arapaho bands and to their Lakota allies. The Sand Creek Massacre, as it came to be known, shocked the nation. Even in the midst of the Civil War, with its unprecedented carnage, Sand Creek stood out as an atrocity. Congressional investigations condemned Chivington's actions, though he escaped formal punishment. But the damage was done. The Cheyenne who had advocated for peace felt betrayed. The message seemed clear. The Americans could not be trusted, and peace was impossible. The Cheyenne response was swift and fierce. In January 1865, a large force of Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Lakota warriors attacked the town of Julesburg in northeastern Colorado, overwhelming the small garrison and sacking the town. Over the following months, the alliance raided along the South Platte River, attacking stage stations, wagon trains, and settlements. The Platte Road, the main route to Denver and the Western Territories, was effectively closed for months. This period, sometimes called the Cheyenne War of 1864-65, represented the Cheyenne fighting at the height of their power. Mounted on their finest horses, armed with rifles, bows, and lances, Cheyenne warriors were formidable opponents. They knew the country intimately, could move rapidly across vast distances, and could concentrate forces for attacks and then disperse before soldiers could respond. But the United States had enormous advantages. It had an essentially unlimited supply of men, weapons, and resources. It controlled the manufacturing capacity to produce weapons and ammunition, and it had the determination to win, whatever the cost. The Civil War ended in April 1865, freeing up thousands of veteran soldiers to be sent west to deal with the Indian problem. In October 1865, Cheyenne and Arapaho leaders met with government representatives on the Little Arkansas River in Kansas. The resulting treaty attempted to establish peace by assigning the tribes to a reservation in Indian Territory, present-day Oklahoma. Many Cheyenne, particularly in the north, rejected this treaty, refusing to move to the assigned reservation. Even those who signed often had no intention of abiding by its terms, seeing it as a temporary expedient to gain time and access to promised goods. The late 1860s were a confusing period for the Cheyenne. The Southern Cheyenne were divided between those who attempted to accommodate American demands and those who refused. The Northern Cheyenne, ranging through the Powder River country with their Lakota allies, were increasingly being drawn into conflicts over the Bozeman Trail, a road that ran through their hunting grounds to the Montana goldfields. In 1867, the United States made another attempt to establish peace, resulting in the Medicine Lodge Treaty. This treaty assigned the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho to a reservation in Indian Territory, promising support, protection, and assistance in exchange for the tribe giving up its claim to most of its traditional territory. Black Kettle, still advocating for peace despite his experience at Sand Creek, signed the treaty and took his band to the assigned reservation. But many Cheyenne, particularly the Dog Soldiers, rejected the treaty. They continued to range across the Central Plains, hunting buffalo and raiding white settlements when opportunity or need arose. The conflict between those Cheyenne who sought accommodation and those who chose resistance created deep divisions within the tribe, sometimes setting relatives against each other. The U.S. Army, frustrated by its inability to force the Cheyenne and other Plains tribes onto reservations, changed tactics. Instead of chasing warriors across the plains in fruitless pursuits, the army would strike at the tribe's homes, attacking their villages, destroying their food supplies and shelter, and killing their horses. This strategy targeted not just warriors, but entire communities, recognizing that it was impossible to defeat the Plains tribes militarily without destroying their ability to maintain their way of life. This strategy was implemented with devastating effect on November 27, 1868, when Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer led the 7th Cavalry in an attack on Black Kettle's village on the Washita River in Indian Territory. Once again, Black Kettle was camped peacefully, believing his people were safe on the reservation where the government had told them to go. Once again, he raised an American flag over his lodge, and once again, it meant nothing. Custer's attack came at dawn, following the same pattern as Sand Creek 4 years earlier. The village was caught completely by surprise. Soldiers charged in from multiple directions, firing into teepees, killing anyone they saw. Black Kettle and his wife, trying to escape across the river, were shot and killed. By the time the attack ended, over 100 Cheyenne were dead, the village was destroyed, and over 800 horses had been killed to prevent the survivors from using them. The Battle of the Washita, as the army called it, was hailed as a great victory. Custer had proven that the army could strike the tribes in their winter camps, destroying their ability to wage war. But from the Cheyenne perspective, it was another massacre, another betrayal, another demonstration that the Americans made no distinction between those who sought peace and those who chose war. The 1870s would see the final struggle of the Cheyenne to maintain their independence on the plains. The Northern Cheyenne, allied with the Lakota and Northern Arapaho, fought to preserve their hunting grounds in the Powder River country. The Southern Cheyenne, divided and demoralized, made sporadic attempts to resist confinement to reservations but faced overwhelming military force. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 marked a turning point. The railroad divided the buffalo herds into northern and southern populations and brought buffalo hunters onto the plains in unprecedented numbers. These commercial hunters, armed with powerful long-range rifles, slaughtered buffalo by the millions for their hides, leaving the carcasses to rot on the prairie. The southern herd was essentially destroyed by 1878, taking with it the foundation of the southern plains, people's way of life. Without buffalo, the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho had no choice but to accept dependence on government rations issued at the reservation agency. But the rations were often insufficient, of poor quality, or delayed by corruption and bureaucratic incompetence. People went hungry. Children suffered from malnutrition. Disease spread through the crowded camps. Some Cheyenne, particularly the Dog Soldiers, refused to accept this fate. In 1874-75, they participated in the Red River War, a multi-tribal resistance to reservation confinement that ranged across the southern plains. The army responded with a winter campaign, relentlessly pursuing hostile bands, destroying their camps and killing their horses until resistance became impossible. In the north, the Northern Cheyenne participated in the Great Sioux War of 1876 and 77, the last major conflict between the Plains tribes and the United States. This war culminated in the Battle of the Little Bighorn on June 25, 1876, when a large force of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors annihilated Custer's 7th Cavalry. Cheyenne warriors played a crucial role in the battle, including in the initial engagement that drew Custer into his fatal attack. But the victory at Little Bighorn, celebrated in Cheyenne oral tradition and song, was also the beginning of the end. The United States responded to Custer's defeat with massive retaliation. More soldiers, better equipped and more ruthlessly led, poured into the Powder River country. Winter campaigns struck at Cheyenne and Lakota camps, destroying food supplies and shelter. One by one, the great chiefs surrendered or were killed. The Northern Cheyenne fought on longer than most. In November 1876, Colonel Ranald Mackenzie attacked the village of Dull Knife and Little Wolf on the Red Fork of the Powder River. The attack came at dawn in bitter cold. Soldiers captured the village, destroyed over 200 lodges, killed horses and dogs, and burned everything the Cheyenne owned, including food supplies, for winter. The survivors fled into the mountains in sub-zero temperatures, many without adequate clothing or footwear. 11 babies froze to death the first night. Despite this disaster, the Northern Cheyenne continued to resist. But by the spring of 1877, starvation and exhaustion had taken their toll. Most of the Northern Cheyenne, along with their Lakota allies, had surrendered and been forced onto reservations. A few bands under Dull Knife and Little Wolf held out in the Powder River country, but their situation was hopeless. In the spring of 1877, Dull Knife and Little Wolf finally brought their people to surrender at Fort Robinson, Nebraska. The army then made a fateful decision. Rather than allowing the Northern Cheyenne to remain in the north, where they wanted to be, they would be sent to Indian Territory to join the Southern Cheyenne on the reservation there. This decision would lead to one of the most remarkable episodes in Cheyenne history. In the summer of 1877, approximately 1,000 Northern Cheyenne arrived at the Cheyenne and Arapaho Reservation in Indian Territory. They came reluctantly, having been promised they could return north if they were unhappy in the south. They were unhappy almost immediately. The climate was wrong, hot and humid instead of the cool, dry air of the Powder River country. The landscape was wrong, flat and treeless instead of the mountains and valleys they knew. Disease swept through the Northern Cheyenne camps with devastating effect. Malaria, which they had no resistance to, killed dozens. Food was inadequate. The Southern Cheyenne, themselves struggling to survive on insufficient rations, could offer little help to their relatives from the north. By the summer of 1878, nearly 1/3 of the Northern Cheyenne who had come south were dead. The survivors, led by Dull Knife and Little Wolf, made a decision. They would go home. They would return to the Powder River country where they belonged, where they could breathe properly and live as Cheyenne. They knew it would be difficult and dangerous. They knew the army would pursue them, but they also knew that to stay meant death. On the night of September 9th, 1878, approximately 300 Northern Cheyenne men, women, and children slipped away from the reservation and began the long journey north. They traveled mostly at night, covering 20 or 30 miles before resting during the day. They avoided settlements and travelers when possible, raiding for horses and supplies when necessary. The army mobilized to stop them. Thousands of soldiers from multiple forts were dispatched to intercept the fleeing Cheyenne. Telegraph wires carried news of their movements. Newspapers followed the story with breathless coverage. The entire nation, it seemed, was watching as a few hundred desperate Cheyenne attempted the impossible. But the Cheyenne evaded their pursuers with skill born of generations of plains warfare. They split into small groups, leaving confusing trails. They moved with astonishing speed, covering ground that soldiers on tired horses could not match. When cornered, they fought with desperate courage, breaking through encirclements and disappearing into the landscape. Several times, soldiers caught up with them and forced battles. At Turkey Springs, at Punished Woman's Fork, Cheyenne warriors held off superior forces while women and children escaped. People were killed, both Cheyenne and whites, but the exodus continued. As they moved north through Kansas and into Nebraska, the group divided. Dull Knife's band, consisting of older people and families, turned east toward Fort Robinson, hoping to find refuge there. Little Wolf's band, mostly younger people and warriors, continued north toward the Powder River. Dull Knife's decision to seek refuge at Fort Robinson proved tragic. When they arrived at the fort in October 1878, they were initially well treated. But then came orders from Washington. The Northern Cheyenne must return to Indian Territory. Dull Knife and his people refused. They would rather die than return to the reservation that had killed so many of their relatives. In January 1879, to force compliance, the army confined Dull Knife's people to their barracks and cut off all food, water, and firewood. For 6 days in bitter winter cold, the Cheyenne endured this treatment without yielding. Then, on the night of January 9th, knowing they faced death either way, they broke out. They had hidden a few firearms, taken apart and concealed during their confinement. They had made weapons from any material they could find. As soldiers slept or relaxed, believing the Cheyenne were too weak to resist, the breakout began. Windows were smashed, doors forced, and the Cheyenne poured out into the winter night, running for the bluffs beyond the fort. Soldiers responded immediately, firing into the fleeing Cheyenne. Cheyenne warriors fought back, trying to cover the escape of women and children. Running through deep snow in sub-zero temperatures, many barefoot or poorly clothed, the Cheyenne scattered into the night. Over the next 2 weeks, soldiers hunted down the escapees. Most were killed or recaptured. Dull Knife and a small group made it to the safety of the Red Cloud Agency, where Lakota relatives sheltered them. Of the approximately 150 Northern Cheyenne who had come to Fort Robinson with Dull Knife, 64 were killed during the breakout and subsequent pursuit. The survivors were eventually allowed to remain in the North, a tragic victory bought with enormous suffering. Little Wolf's band, meanwhile, had continued north successfully. They spent the winter of 1878-79 hidden in the sand hills of Nebraska, avoiding all contact with soldiers or settlers. In the spring of 1879, they surrendered to Lieutenant William P. Clark, who had been sent specifically to find them and had promised fair treatment. Little Wolf's people were eventually allowed to settle in Montana, on land near the Tongue River, which would become the Northern Cheyenne Reservation. The exodus of the Northern Cheyenne captured the imagination of the American public. Newspapers, even those generally hostile to Indians, praised the courage and determination of the Cheyenne. The suffering imposed on them at Fort Robinson shocked many Americans and contributed to some reforms in Indian policy. But it had come too late for those who died during the Exodus and the Fort Robinson breakout. By 1880, the Cheyenne's era of freedom on the plains was over. The Northern Cheyenne had their reservation in Montana, centered on the Tongue River. The Southern Cheyenne shared a reservation in Indian Territory with the Arapaho, later joined by other tribes. Both groups faced the challenge of adapting to radically different circumstances while trying to preserve their identity as Tsitsistas. The reservations represented a fundamental attack on Cheyenne culture. The government's goal was not simply to confine the Cheyenne geographically, but to transform them into Christian farmers who had abandoned their savage ways. This policy, often called assimilation, sought to destroy everything that made the Cheyenne who they were. Children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools, sometimes hundreds of miles away, where they were forbidden to speak Cheyenne, forced to cut their hair, dressed in European-style clothing, and punished for any expression of their traditional culture. The boarding school motto, "Kill the Indian, save the man," expressed the philosophy behind this policy. These schools operated on the assumption that Cheyenne culture was worthless and that the only way to help Cheyenne children was to strip away their identity and replace it with white American culture. The trauma inflicted by the boarding school system cannot be overstated. Children were torn from parents who had no legal recourse to prevent it. They experienced physical, emotional, and sometimes sexual abuse. They were taught to be ashamed of their heritage. Many died from disease, mistreatment, or despair, far from home and family. Those who survived and returned to the reservation often found themselves caught between two worlds, no longer fully comfortable in Cheyenne society, but not accepted as equals in white society. Traditional religious practices were banned. The sun dance, the sacred arrow ceremonies, and other essential elements of Cheyenne spirituality were forbidden under the Code of Indian Offenses, which treated traditional religious practices as crimes. Agents could imprison Cheyenne who participated in traditional ceremonies or confiscate sacred objects. The economic foundation of Cheyenne life, the buffalo herds, was gone. The government expected the Cheyenne to become farmers, but the reservation lands, particularly in Montana, were not well suited to agriculture. Moreover, farming was seen as women's work in traditional Cheyenne culture. It was difficult for men to accept this role reversal. The promised support, tools, training, supplies often failed to materialize or was inadequate. Rations issued by the government were frequently insufficient and of poor quality. Beef was supposed to replace buffalo, but it was often issued as living cattle that had to be killed by the Cheyenne themselves, a pale echo of the buffalo hunts that had sustained their ancestors. Corruption was rampant, with agents and contractors pocketing funds meant for the tribes or delivering goods far below the contracted quality. Disease continued to ravage Cheyenne communities. Tuberculosis, spread by crowded housing conditions and weakened immune systems due to poor nutrition, killed hundreds. Eye diseases caused by smoky, poorly ventilated housing led to widespread blindness. Children died of preventable diseases because medical care was inadequate or unavailable. Yet despite all of this, the confinement, the attacks on their culture, the poverty, the disease, the trauma, the Cheyenne survived as a people. They adapted where they had to, resisted where they could, and preserved what was most essential. The Cheyenne language continued to be spoken, often in secret but sometimes openly, as parents and grandparents taught it to children despite official prohibition. Stories continued to be told, passing on history, values, and cultural knowledge from one generation to the next. Sacred objects were hidden and protected, brought out in secret for ceremonies that the authorities never learned about. Some Cheyenne found ways to work within the system while maintaining their identity. They became scouts for the army, using their skills and knowledge to support themselves and their families. They worked as interpreters, teachers, and intermediaries between the Cheyenne community and the white authorities. They learned English, acquired literacy, and used these skills to advocate for their people. Others chose more open resistance. They defied prohibitions on religious practices, conducting ceremonies despite the risk of punishment. They refused to send their children to boarding schools or found ways to bring them home. They maintained traditional gender roles and social structures even as the government tried to impose a different model. The warrior societies, though their military function was obsolete, continued as social and cultural organizations. They held dances and ceremonies, maintained their regalia and songs, and passed on their traditions to new generations. The societies provided continuity with the past and a sense of identity and purpose for Cheyenne men in a world that seemed to have no place for warriors. Women, too, found ways to maintain cultural continuity. Traditional crafts, beadwork, quillwork, hide tanning, continued to be practiced and taught. These skills were not merely aesthetic, they embodied cultural knowledge, connected practitioners to their ancestors, and provided tangible links to the past. Women also served as keepers of domestic life, maintaining households in ways that preserved elements of traditional culture even as the external circumstances changed dramatically. The early 20th century brought new challenges. In 1887, the Dawes Act divided reservation lands into individual allotments, with surplus lands being opened to white settlement. This policy aimed to destroy tribal land ownership and force Indians to become individual property owners. On the southern Cheyenne and Arapaho reservation, this resulted in the loss of millions of acres of land as surplus was claimed by whites in the Oklahoma land runs. The northern Cheyenne narrowly avoided this fate. Through the efforts of leaders who had learned to navigate the legal and political systems of the United States, they managed to preserve their reservation as tribal land. But they could not prevent the poverty, the continued attacks on their culture, or the seemingly endless series of challenges that came with reservation life. World War I brought changes as Cheyenne men enlisted to serve in the U.S. military. This created complex feelings. They were fighting for a country that had conquered their people and suppressed their culture, yet military service also resonated with the warrior traditions that had always been central to Cheyenne identity. Cheyenne soldiers distinguished themselves in combat, earning recognition and, in some cases, helping to shift attitudes about Native Americans. The 1930s brought some relief with the Indian Reorganization Act, which ended the allotment policy and allowed tribes to establish self-government. Both the Northern and Southern Cheyenne adopted constitutions and created tribal councils, giving them some degree of control over their own affairs. But these changes also created new divisions, as traditional leaders sometimes found themselves at odds with elected tribal governments operating under constitutions written by white lawyers. The mid-20th century saw gradual improvements in some aspects of Cheyenne life, though profound challenges remained. The Indian Claims Commission, established in 1946, allowed tribes to sue the government for lands taken through broken treaties. The Cheyenne filed claims and eventually received monetary compensation, though no amount of money could truly compensate for the loss of their territory and way of life. Education remained contentious. The boarding school system gradually declined after World War II, but Cheyenne children still often attended schools that denigrated their culture and history. It was not until the 1970s that significant changes occurred, with the passage of the Indian Self-Determination Act and later the Indian Education Act, which gave tribes more control over their children's education and required schools to include Native American history and culture in their curricula. Religious freedom, incredibly, was not fully protected for Native Americans until 1978, when the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed. For the first time in nearly a century, it became clearly legal for the Cheyenne to practice their traditional religion. The Sundance, which had continued in secret or in modified forms, could now be conducted openly. Sacred objects that had been hidden could be brought out without fear of confiscation. Traditional healing practices could be pursued without prosecution. This religious freedom led to a cultural renaissance among the Cheyenne. Younger people who had grown up disconnected from traditional culture began to seek out elders and learn Cheyenne language, stories, and ceremonies. The sun dance, which had survived through the dedication of keepers who maintained it, despite prohibition, was revitalized and became a central expression of Cheyenne identity. Language revitalization efforts began, recognizing that the Cheyenne language, like many Native American languages, was in danger of disappearing as fluent speakers aged and died. Programs were established to teach Cheyenne to children and adults, to document the language, and to create teaching materials. These efforts faced enormous challenges. Decades of suppression had interrupted the natural transmission of the language from generation to generation, and the dominance of English in schools, media, and daily life made it difficult for young people to become fluent. The recovery of sacred objects held in museums and private collections became a priority. The sacred buffalo hat, which had remained with its keeper through all the years of upheaval, continued to be carefully guarded. The sacred arrows, which had been taken during conflicts in the 19th century, were eventually recovered and returned to the Cheyenne in the 1990s after years of negotiation. The return of these objects, central to Cheyenne identity and spirituality, was an enormously significant event, treated with the gravity it deserved. Economic development on the reservations proved challenging. The Northern Cheyenne Reservation in Montana, while beautiful, offered limited economic opportunities. Coal deposits on the reservation became controversial. While development could bring revenue, it also threatened the environment and clashed with traditional values about proper relationship with the land. The tribe struggled to balance the need for economic development with the desire to protect the land and maintain their culture. The Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho in Oklahoma faced different challenges. Their reservation had been dissolved during the allotment era, and their land base was much reduced. But they maintained their tribal identity and governmental structures. They established businesses, including casinos, which provided revenue and employment, though gambling also brought social problems. Healthcare improved gradually through the Indian Health Service, though significant disparities remained between Native Americans and the general U.S. population in life expectancy, infant mortality, and prevalence of certain diseases. Historical trauma, the cumulative psychological impact of generations of oppression, violence, and cultural disruption, manifested in high rates of substance abuse, suicide, and domestic violence in Cheyenne communities, as in many Native American communities. Yet alongside these challenges, there were also successes and reasons for hope. Cheyenne writers, artists, and scholars began documenting and sharing their culture on their own terms. John Stands in Timber, a Northern Cheyenne, worked with anthropologist Margot Liberty to produce Cheyenne Memories, an invaluable oral history. Lance Henson and other Cheyenne poets gave voice to contemporary Cheyenne experience. Artists working in both traditional and contemporary media created works that expressed Cheyenne identity and perspective. Cheyenne people achieved success in various fields while maintaining their cultural identity. They became teachers, doctors, lawyers, business people, and tribal leaders. They learned to navigate both the Cheyenne world and the broader American society, code switching between cultures as needed while remaining grounded in their identity as tsitsistas. The late 20th and early 21st centuries saw increasing assertion of tribal sovereignty. Both Northern and Southern Cheyenne tribal governments worked to expand their authority over matters affecting their communities. They established tribal courts, law enforcement agencies, and social service programs. They fought legal battles to protect their rights and resources. They forged relationships with state and federal governments based on government-to-government relations, rather than the paternalistic model that had prevailed for so long. Environmental issues became increasingly important. The Northern Cheyenne fought successfully against strip mining on their reservation in the 1970s, setting a precedent for tribal environmental protection. They worked to preserve the landscape they considered sacred and to ensure that development, when it occurred, was on their terms and consistent with their values. Today, the Cheyenne people continue to exist as distinct, sovereign nations. The Northern Cheyenne tribe in Montana and the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes in Oklahoma each have their own governments, their own territories, though much reduced from the vast ranges of the past, and their own challenges and opportunities. The Northern Cheyenne Reservation in southeastern Montana encompasses over 400,000 acres of rolling grasslands, pine-covered hills, and river valleys. It is home to approximately 5,000 enrolled tribal members, though not all live on the reservation. The landscape is beautiful, relatively unspoiled, and deeply meaningful to the Cheyenne who live there. This is the land their ancestors fought to return to during the 1878 Exodus. It is where the bones of their people rest, where sacred sites are located, where the connection to the land and history is most immediate. Life on the Northern Cheyenne Reservation reflects both continuity and change. Many people live in modern houses and drive pickup trucks. They watch television, use the internet, and participate in the global economy. Yet they also maintain cattle and horses in ways that echo, however distantly, the equestrian culture of their ancestors. They gather for sun dances and other ceremonies. They speak Cheyenne, at least some of them, and make conscious efforts to pass the language to their children. They maintain cultural practices, from traditional foods to art forms, to values about generosity and respect. Economic challenges remain significant. Unemployment on the reservation is high. Poverty rates exceed national averages. Many homes lack adequate infrastructure. Educational outcomes lag behind state and national averages. These problems are the legacy of historical trauma and ongoing structural inequalities, not personal or cultural failings. Yet there are also successes. The Northern Cheyenne have maintained control over much of their land base, resisting pressures to sell or lease to outside interests. They have developed educational programs rooted in Cheyenne culture and language. They have built a healthcare system that incorporates both Western medicine and traditional healing practices. They have created economic opportunities through tribally owned enterprises, careful resource management, and partnerships with outside entities. The Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho in Oklahoma face a different set of circumstances. Their traditional reservation was dissolved long ago, and their people are more geographically dispersed. Many live in cities like Oklahoma City or rural areas spread across western Oklahoma. Yet they maintain their tribal government, centered in Concho, Oklahoma, and their sense of identity as Cheyenne and Arapaho people. The Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho have been more economically successful than their northern relatives in some ways, developing casinos and other businesses that generate revenue for tribal programs. These resources have allowed them to provide services to tribal members, preserve cultural sites and practices, and exercise greater self-determination. Yet they too struggle with many of the same social problems that affect the Northern Cheyenne and other Native American communities. For both groups, maintaining Cheyenne culture and identity in the 21st century requires conscious effort and commitment. The forces of assimilation, while less overtly coercive than in the past, remain powerful. English dominates most interactions. Popular culture is overwhelmingly non-native. Economic opportunities often require participation in the broader American economy in ways that can pull people away from their communities and traditions. Yet Cheyenne people continue to adapt and persist, as they have for centuries. Parents teach their children to speak Cheyenne, even if imperfectly. Elders share stories and knowledge with those who seek it. Communities gather for sun dances, for naming ceremonies, for memorial feasts, for the simple socializing that maintains relationships and reinforces identity. Artists create works that express both traditional knowledge and contemporary experience. Scholars document history and culture, ensuring that future generations will have access to their heritage. The Cheyenne relationship with the United States remains complex. Historical grievances have not been forgotten, nor should they be. The memory of Sand Creek, the Washita, the Fort Robinson breakout, and countless other injustices is maintained in oral tradition, ceremony, and collective memory. Yet the Cheyenne also recognize that they must work within the reality of American power while asserting their rights as sovereign nations. This often means engagement with federal, state, and local governments on multiple levels. Tribal leaders testify before Congress, negotiate with federal agencies, enter into compacts with state governments, and forge relationships with neighboring communities. They fight in court when necessary to protect treaty rights and tribal sovereignty. They participate in the political process, supporting candidates and policies that respect tribal rights and interests. The Cheyenne have also built connections with other Native American tribes, both through formal organizations like the National Congress of American Indians and through less formal networks of cooperation and solidarity. Many of the challenges facing the Cheyenne, protecting sovereignty, preserving culture, achieving economic development, addressing social problems, are shared by Native peoples across the continent. By working together, tribes can more effectively advocate for their interests and support each other's efforts. Internationally, the Cheyenne and other Native American tribes have participated in movements for indigenous rights, connecting with indigenous peoples from around the world who face similar challenges. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, adopted in 2007, reflects decades of advocacy by indigenous peoples globally and provides a framework for protecting indigenous rights that the Cheyenne and others can invoke. The land remains central to Cheyenne identity, though the relationship to land has necessarily changed. The vast buffalo ranges are gone, divided into private property, national grasslands, and other holdings. But the northern Cheyenne still occupy part of their ancestral territory, and the landscape itself, the hills, rivers, and grasslands, connects them to their history and ancestors. Sacred sites, from Bear Butte in South Dakota to various locations within the reservation and beyond, remain important for spiritual practices and historical memory. The Southern Cheyenne, while lacking a contiguous reservation, maintain connections to places significant in their history. Sites associated with Sand Creek, the Washita, and other events are visited, memorialized, and incorporated into efforts to educate both Cheyenne people and the broader public about this history. In recent years, there has been growing recognition by the broader American society of the injustices committed against Native Americans, including the Cheyenne. Sites of massacres like Sand Creek have been designated as National Historic Sites. Apologies have been issued, though often qualified or insufficient. There is more acknowledgement in mainstream education and media of Native American perspectives and experiences. Yet this recognition is incomplete and contested. Native American history is still often marginalized in American historical narratives. When it is included, it is frequently framed as tragedy in the past, rather than ongoing injustice and resilience in the present. The challenges facing contemporary Native American communities, poverty, health disparities, educational gaps, are often attributed to personal or cultural failings rather than to the legacy of colonialism and ongoing structural inequalities. For the Cheyenne, the work of maintaining their culture, protecting their rights, and building prosperous communities continues. Each generation faces the challenge of remaining Cheyenne while adapting to changing circumstances. The specific challenges change, from resisting military conquest to surviving reservation confinement to navigating the complexities of the 21st century. But the fundamental task remains: preserving the identity and values that make the Cheyenne who they are. As we come to the end of our journey through Cheyenne history, it is worth reflecting on what we have learned and what the Cheyenne story tells us about resilience, adaptation, and the enduring strength of culture. The Cheyenne transformed themselves from woodland villagers to equestrian buffalo hunters, mastering a new environment and way of life with remarkable speed and success. They built a culture that was sophisticated, rich in meaning, and well adapted to the demands of plains life. They developed social structures that balanced individual achievement with collective welfare, spiritual practices that maintained harmony with the natural and supernatural worlds, and values that emphasized courage, generosity, and wisdom. When confronted with American expansion, the Cheyenne fought to preserve their way of life with a courage and determination that even their enemies acknowledged. Against overwhelming odds, superior numbers, technology, and resources, they resisted for decades, winning significant victories and inflicting heavy casualties on U.S. forces. When military resistance became impossible, they found other ways to resist, maintaining their culture in secret, adapting without surrendering their identity, surviving when survival itself was an act of defiance. The Cheyenne experienced trauma on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. Massacres killed entire communities. Diseases decimated their population. Their children were taken and subjected to cultural genocide in boarding schools. Their sacred practices were criminalized. Their land was stolen. Their way of life was deliberately destroyed. The psychological, social, and cultural damage from these experiences persists to this day, manifesting in problems that no quick solution can resolve. Yet the Cheyenne survived, not just physically, though that itself was no small achievement, but culturally and spiritually. They remained tsitsistas, the people, through everything that was done to them. They preserved their language when it was forbidden to speak it. They maintained their ceremonies when practicing them was illegal. They passed on their stories and values to new generations despite systematic attempts to erase their culture. This survival was not inevitable. Other peoples facing similar pressures disappeared, were absorbed into other groups, or lost so much of their culture that what remained was unrecognizable. The Cheyenne's survival as a distinct people with a living culture required conscious choice and sustained effort by generation after generation. It required courage, creativity, and an unbreakable commitment to remaining Cheyenne. The Cheyenne story also illuminates the larger history of the United States and the often uncomfortable truths about how the nation was built. The beautiful landscape of the American West, celebrated in art and literature, was taken through violence and broken promises from peoples who had lived there for centuries. The economic development of the Plains states was enabled by the destruction of the buffalo herds and the confinement of the peoples who depended on them. The expansion of American power and prosperity came at enormous costs to those who stood in its way. This is not to say that the Cheyenne were passive victims. They were agents in their own history, making choices, developing strategies, and shaping their own destiny as much as circumstances allowed. They were not defeated because they were inferior, but because they faced an enemy with vastly greater resources who was willing to wage total war against entire populations, targeting not just warriors, but women, children, and the foundations of Cheyenne society itself. The Cheyenne today carry this history with them. It shapes their relationship with the United States, their understanding of their place in the world, and their determination to preserve and strengthen their culture. The memory of ancestors who endured unimaginable hardship provides both inspiration and obligation. Inspiration to persevere through current challenges, obligation to honor those sacrifices by maintaining the culture they fought to preserve. For those of us who are not Cheyenne, the Cheyenne story offers important lessons. It reminds us that American history is more complex and troubling than simplified narratives suggest. It demonstrates the resilience of the human spirit, and the power of culture to sustain people through even the worst circumstances. It challenges us to recognize ongoing injustices and to support Native peoples' efforts to exercise self-determination and preserve their cultures. The Cheyenne are not relics of the past, museum pieces to be studied and filed away. They are living peoples with contemporary concerns, aspirations, and challenges. The Northern Cheyenne in Montana and the Cheyenne and Arapaho in Oklahoma are shaping their own futures, drawing on their deep cultural roots while engaging with the modern world. They are raising children, building communities, protecting their environment, practicing their religions, speaking their language, and asserting their rights as sovereign nations. Their story is not over. The challenges they face, economic development, cultural preservation, health disparities, protecting sovereignty, are significant. But the Cheyenne have faced existential challenges before and survived. They have adapted repeatedly while maintaining their core identity. They have found ways to be both fully Cheyenne and fully part of the 21st century world. As we close this narrative, let us acknowledge the Cheyenne people, those who lived in the eastern woodlands in times so far past that memory has faded. Those who migrated westward and transformed themselves into masters of the plains. Those who hunted buffalo across endless grasslands and lived in teepees under vast skies. Those who fought for their freedom and their way of life with a courage that commands respect. Those who survived massacres and military defeat and confinement to reservations. Those who endured boarding schools and cultural suppression and poverty. Those who kept the language alive, who preserved the ceremonies, who maintained the stories. And those who live today, carrying forward the identity and culture of the Sisters into an uncertain but hope-filled future. The Cheyenne story is ultimately a story of persistence, of a people who refuse to disappear, who maintain their identity through centuries of change and challenge, and who continue to exist as a distinct people with their own culture, language, and way of understanding the world. It is a story that deserves to be known, to be understood in its complexity and nuance, and to be honored for what it reveals about human resilience and the enduring power of culture. As you reflect on this history, may you carry with you not just facts and events, but a deeper understanding of the Cheyenne people, their achievements, their suffering, their resistance, and their survival. May you recognize that Native American history is not separate from American history, but integral to it, that the story of the United States cannot be fully understood without understanding the stories of peoples like the Cheyenne. And may you appreciate that the Cheyenne, like other Native peoples, are not vanishing remnants of the past, but living nations with their own futures to create. Thank you for taking this journey through Cheyenne history. May it bring you knowledge, understanding, and perhaps inspiration from the example of a people who, Through everything remained who they were, the Tsitsistas, the Cheyenne, our people.